My father banned me from his wedding because I looked like my mother. Now his new wife won't have kids with him. My dad Roger and I were always close growing up. After my mom Elaine cheated on him with his business partner when I was 14, he got full custody and we became a team. Every Friday we'd get takeout from this Cuban place and watch whatever movie I picked. He came to every soccer game, helped with homework he didn't understand, and learned to braid hair from YouTube when I needed it for tournaments. He never said a bad word about my mom even though she basically disappeared after the divorce to start a new family with the guy she cheated with. We were solid for 8 years. Then he met Brittany at some conference when I was 22. She was 31, worked in pharmaceutical sales, and looked nothing like my mom. Where my mom was tall with dark hair and brown eyes like mine, Brittany was short, blonde, and had green eyes. Dad was 50 and absolutely smitten. I was happy for him because he deserved to find someone after being alone for so long. Brittany seemed nice enough at first. She laughed at his bad jokes, encouraged him to take that promotion he'd been nervous about, and even asked me about college and my plans after graduation. 6 months in, they got engaged. I helped him pick the ring. He was nervous like a teenager, and it was actually cute seeing him that excited about something again. The wedding planning started normal. Brittany asked my opinion on flowers. We went cake tasting together, and she even asked me to give a speech. Dad kept saying how perfect everything was, how this was his second chance at happiness. Then Brittany started making comments. She'd stare at me during dinner and say it was creepy how much I looked like the photos she'd seen. Dad would change the subject. She'd ask if I'd gotten my personality from my mother too. Dad would tell her to stop. She'd wonder out loud if cheating was genetic. Dad would get quiet. 3 months before the wedding, Brittany suggested I might be more comfortable not being in the wedding party since people might think about Dad's first marriage seeing me up there. Dad said that was ridiculous. I was his daughter and obviously I'd be there. Brittany dropped it but started finding reasons I couldn't come to wedding planning meetings. The venue was too far for me to drive after classes. The dress shopping was during my work shift. The caterer tasting was family only. Dad didn't notice the pattern. 2 weeks before the wedding, we had the rehearsal dinner. Brittany had been drinking wine since noon. She pulled my dad aside, but I could hear her from across the room. She said looking at me was like looking at a ghost, that I was ruining her special time, that she couldn't compete with his past when it was standing right there with Elaine's face. Dad told her she was being dramatic. She said he had to choose between his fresh start and his painful history. That's what she called me. His painful history. Dad came over after and said Brittany was just stressed about the wedding. The morning of the wedding, I was getting ready at the hotel with my cousin when Dad knocked. He stood in the doorway and couldn't look at me. He said Brittany was having anxiety about the wedding and thought it would be better if I didn't attend. I laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He said I could come to the reception later, but not the ceremony because Brittany didn't want my mom's face in her wedding photos. I reminded him my mom hadn't been around for 8 years. He said it didn't matter because I looked exactly like her, and it was triggering for Brittany to see the face of the woman he first married. I asked if he was really choosing his new wife over his daughter. He said I was making him sound like a villain when he was just trying to keep the peace on his wedding day. He said I should understand since I knew how much Mom hurt him. He said seeing me in the church would remind everyone of his failure, and Brittany deserved better than that on her special day. He actually said I could watch from the hotel and he'd have someone stream it for me. I packed my stuff and left while he was getting married. My cousin stayed and told me everything. During the father-daughter dance song, people started asking where I was. Brittany told everyone I had a stomach bug. My aunt loudly asked what kind of father doesn't have his only child at his wedding. My uncle said it was shameful. My dad's own brother gave a speech about family loyalty and looked right at my dad the whole time. The reception ended early because half the family left in protest. Dad called me 47 times that night. I turned my phone off after the first 10 calls. By call 20, I'd blocked his number. Nadia found me sitting on her bathroom floor at 2 in the morning, still in the dress I'd packed for the reception I never attended. She didn't ask questions, just sat down next to me and handed me a glass of water. The next 3 days blurred together in her guest room. My phone stayed off in a drawer. Nadia brought me food I barely touched and sat with me during the hours I couldn't sleep. She'd ask if I wanted to talk, and I'd shake my head because what words existed for this kind of betrayal? The man who learned to braid hair from YouTube videos had chosen a woman he'd known 18 months over the daughter he raised alone for 8 years. Every time I tried to explain it to myself, the logic broke apart. He picked her comfort over my existence at his own wedding. On the 4th day, someone knocked on Nadia's apartment door around 6 in the evening. She went to answer it and I heard his voice from the guest room. Dad sounded tired, asking if I was there, saying he needed to see me. Nadia told him to wait in the hallway. She came back and asked if I wanted her to send him away. Part of me wanted to hide forever, but another part needed to hear what possible explanation he thought would make this okay. I told her I'd talk to him, but not here. We met at the coffee shop 2 blocks from Nadia's place 30 minutes later. Dad looked like he hadn't slept since the wedding. His shirt was wrinkled and he had dark circles under his eyes that made him look older than 50. He ordered coffee neither of us drank and started talking before I even sat down. Brittany's father left when she was 7. She watched her mother fall apart, watched her get replaced by a new family, developed severe anxiety around being compared to previous relationships. Seeing me at the wedding would have triggered all that trauma. The ceremony photos would have been ruined by her panic attacks. He went on for 20 minutes about Brittany's abandonment issues, her therapy history, her fear of being second choice. I listened without interrupting and noticed he never once mentioned me. When he finally stopped talking, I pointed out that I was his daughter and had been part of his life for 22 years. He got this defensive look on his face, the one he used to get when Mom's lawyer brought up things he didn't want to discuss during the divorce. He said I was being selfish, that I didn't understand how hard this was for Brittany, that marriage required compromise. Then he actually said I'd understand when I got married someday, like I was a child who couldn't grasp adult relationships instead of the person who lived through his divorce with him. I stood up while he was still talking, told him he chose someone he'd known less than 2 years over the daughter who stood by him when Mom left. He tried to grab my arm and I pulled away. Left him sitting there with 2 full coffee cups and walked outside where Nadia was already waiting in her car. She drove me back to her apartment and I finally cried, the kind of crying that makes your chest hurt and your throat raw. All those Friday nights with Cuban food, all those soccer games in the rain, all those YouTube tutorials for braiding hair, none of it mattered enough when Brittany decided I looked too much like his first marriage. That evening, Aunt Coraline called to check on me. She'd been trying to reach Dad since the wedding, but he wasn't answering her calls either. Apparently, he'd stopped talking to anyone who criticized his choice at the reception, which included most of his siblings and half the cousins. Uncle Nathan had tried to visit, and Brittany answered the door, said Dad wasn't taking visitors. Coraline sounded worried, but also angry in that way she got when family members acted stupid. She told me I had a place to stay with her if I needed it, that the whole family was on my side. 2 weeks went by with nothing from Dad. No calls, no texts, no attempts to explain himself further. I couldn't keep sleeping on Nadia's couch forever, so I started looking at apartments I could afford on my bookstore salary. Dad had helped me save money after graduation for exactly this kind of situation, though I doubt he imagined I'd be using it to get away from him. I found a studio apartment 15 minutes from work, small but clean, available immediately. The landlord ran my credit and approved me within 3 days. I needed to pick up some stuff I'd stored at Dad's house before I could move in. Box of kitchen supplies, some books, winter clothes I hadn't needed at the school. I drove over on a Tuesday afternoon when I knew Dad would be at work. Brittany answered the door in yoga pants and a tank top, holding a protein smoothie. She looked at me like I was a door-to-door salesman. Said Dad wasn't home. I explained I just needed to grab my boxes from the garage. She crossed her arms and said I needed to schedule visits in advance now, that she couldn't just have people showing up whenever they wanted. People. She called me people. I'd eaten dinner at this house dozens of times over the past year. I'd helped Dad pick out the couch she was probably sitting on every night. She was treating me like a stranger trying to break into her home. I called Dad from my car in the driveway. He answered on the 3rd ring, sounding distracted. I told him Brittany wouldn't let me get my belongings. He was quiet for a second, then said her house rules needed to be respected, that I should have called first. Her house. He called it her house when he'd lived there exactly 2 months, and I'd been visiting his homes my entire life. That felt like another door closing, another way of saying I didn't belong in his new life. I asked when I could come by with advance notice. He said he'd check with Brittany and get back to me. He actually said he'd check with her about when his daughter could retrieve her own possessions. Uncle Nathan called me that night after Coraline told him what happened. He said he'd come with me whenever Dad agreed to let me in, that Dad wouldn't pull any garbage with family witnesses present. 3 days later, Dad texted a date and time. Saturday morning at 9. Uncle Nathan picked me up at 8:45. We pulled into the driveway exactly on time and Dad was waiting by the garage door. He tried to hug me and I stepped back. Nathan gave him a look that could freeze water. The garage was hot and smelled like motor oil. My boxes were stacked in the corner where I'd left them 6 months ago, covered in dust. Dad hovered near the door while Nathan and I loaded everything into the truck bed. He kept trying to make conversation, asking about my new apartment, my job at the bookstore, whether I was still thinking about graduate school. Talking like we were casual acquaintances catching up instead of father and daughter in the wreckage of our relationship. Like he hadn't just erased me from the most important day of his life. Nathan didn't say a word to him the entire time. When we finished loading the last box, Dad asked if we could talk soon. I told him I'd think about it. Nathan started the truck and we left Dad standing in his driveway, still trying to pretend everything was normal. I moved into the studio on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs because the building didn't have an elevator. The apartment was smaller than I'd expected, just 1 room with a bathroom and a tiny kitchen in the corner. But it was mine and Dad had no say over who could visit or when I could pick up my belongings. I spent the first week sleeping on an air mattress and eating takeout because I didn't own furniture yet. Nadia brought over some dishes her mom was getting rid of and stayed to help me unpack. She asked if I'd thought about talking to someone professional about everything that happened. I told her I was fine, but she gave me this look that said she didn't believe me. That weekend I woke up crying from a dream where Dad was teaching me to ride a bike, and when I looked up, he was gone. I called 3 therapists on Monday, and the first one had an opening that Thursday. Her office was in a converted house near campus, painted yellow with plants on every surface. She introduced herself and asked what brought me in. I started explaining about the wedding and couldn't stop talking for 40 minutes straight. She listened without interrupting, and when I finally ran out of words, she said something that made my chest hurt. She said Dad's choice to exclude me wasn't a reflection of my worth, but of his inability to stand up to manipulation. She said healthy people don't demand their partners cut off their children, and Dad choosing to comply showed weakness in him, not a flaw in me. I cried for the rest of the session because I'd been carrying this weight that somehow I'd done something wrong by looking like Mom. The weeks passed and October turned into November. Coraline called to invite me to Thanksgiving at her house because she wasn't about to sit at Dad and Brittany's table after what happened. She'd invited Dad too, but he'd already committed to spending the holiday with Brittany's family in Connecticut. I told her I'd come and she sounded relieved. Thanksgiving morning, I drove to Coraline's house and found Nathan already there with his wife and kids. My cousins hugged me and asked where Grandpa Roger was. Nathan told them he was busy this year. We ate turkey and sweet potatoes, and Coraline made Dad's favorite stuffing recipe, but nobody mentioned that he wasn't there to eat it. After dinner, Nathan's oldest daughter asked if she could video call Grandpa to show him her new dance routine. Coraline and Nathan exchanged looks, and Nathan said maybe another time. I helped clean up, and Coraline cornered me in the kitchen. She said Dad had turned down the invitation without even asking if I'd be there, like he'd already decided to keep choosing Brittany's comfort over family. I told her it hurt more than I expected, even though I didn't want to see him anyway. She hugged me and said Dad was making a mistake he'd regret someday, but that didn't make it hurt less right now. The next week, Nadia stopped by my apartment with coffee and said she'd run into someone who knew Brittany from work. The coworker had recognized Brittany's name when Nadia mentioned the wedding situation and said this wasn't the first time Brittany had done something like this. Apparently, Brittany had dated a guy for 3 years before Dad and the relationship ended because the guy had a sister who refused to disappear from his life. Brittany had given him the same ultimatum, her or his sister, and when he wouldn't choose, she left. The coworker said everyone at their office knew Brittany had control issues, and there'd been concerns about how she talked about Dad's family during wedding planning. Nadia asked if I wanted her to tell Dad, but I said no. He wouldn't believe it, and even if he did, he'd already made his choice. What good would it do to tell him his new wife had a pattern of isolating men from their families when he'd already let her isolate him from me? I started noticing things on social media that made my stomach hurt. Dad used to post photos of family dinners and soccer games from when I was younger. His profile picture had been the two of us at my high school graduation for 3 years. Now his profile picture was him and Brittany on their honeymoon. Every post was about Brittany, places they'd gone together, meals they'd cooked, weekend trips to wineries. He'd archived or deleted every photo that showed his life before her. No pictures of Nathan or Coraline, no throwback posts about family holidays, nothing that proved he'd had a daughter or siblings or any existence before Brittany entered his life. It was like he was rewriting his history, building this new perfect life where she was his only family, and his past was something to be erased. I showed Nathan during one of our coffee meetups and he got quiet. He said Dad had unfriended half the family on social media after the wedding, keeping only the people who hadn't criticized his choice. Nathan said it reminded him of how people acted in controlling relationships, cutting off anyone who might point out the problems. My therapist suggested writing Dad a letter explaining how his choice had affected me. She said I didn't have to send it, that the point was processing my feelings by putting them into words. I sat down with my laptop one evening and started typing. The words came faster than I expected. I wrote about feeling erased, about watching him choose comfort over courage, about grieving the father I thought I had. I wrote about the Cuban restaurant and Friday movie nights, and how he'd learned to braid hair from YouTube because he wanted me to feel normal after Mom left. I wrote about how he'd promised we were a team, and then abandoned that team the second someone prettier came along. I wrote about Brittany calling me his painful history, and him not defending me. I wrote 10 pages before I ran out of things to say. I saved the document but didn't send it. Just writing it made something loosen in my chest. Christmas approached, and I wasn't sure what to expect. Dad had skipped Thanksgiving, and I figured he'd skip Christmas too. Then 2 weeks before the holiday, he texted asking if we could meet for coffee. I stared at the message for an hour before responding. We agreed on the same coffee shop where we'd met before. I got there early and ordered tea I didn't drink. Dad showed up 15 minutes late looking stressed. His shirt wrinkled like he'd slept in it. He ordered black coffee and sat across from me. He said things with Brittany were harder than he'd expected, that marriage was more complicated than he remembered. I asked what he meant, and he talked about little things. Her getting upset when he worked late, her not liking his friends from work, her wanting to spend every weekend just the two of them. He said it like he was asking for sympathy. I waited for him to acknowledge the wedding, but he didn't. He talked about his problems with Brittany without once admitting that banning me from his wedding had been wrong. I asked him directly if he regretted his choice. Dad was quiet for a long time, stirring his coffee even though he hadn't added anything to it. He said he regretted how it happened, that he wished it hadn't been so dramatic, that he wished the family hadn't made such a big deal about it. I asked again if he regretted the actual decision to exclude me. He said he regretted that it hurt me, but not the decision itself because keeping peace with Brittany was important for his marriage. He said marriage required compromise and sometimes that meant making hard choices. I felt something break inside me. I'd been holding on to this hope that he'd come to his senses, that he'd realize what he'd done and apologize and we could fix this. But sitting there listening to him justify choosing Brittany's irrational demands over his own daughter, I realized he was never going to choose me over her comfort. He decided his new wife's feelings mattered more than his relationship with me, and no amount of waiting or hoping would change that. I told Dad I needed space to figure out what kind of relationship we could have when he'd made it clear I was secondary to Brittany's feelings. He got upset immediately, his voice rising enough that people at other tables looked over. He said I was being dramatic, that I was punishing him for finding happiness after Mom left, that I should be happy he found someone who made him feel young again. I stood up and told him I was happy he found someone. I just wished that someone didn't require him to erase his daughter to feel secure. He tried to grab my arm, but I pulled away. I left him sitting there with his cold coffee and walked back to my apartment. I didn't cry until I got inside. Nathan called me the day after Christmas. He said Dad had skipped the family gathering again, third holiday in a row that he'd chosen Brittany's plans over family tradition. Nathan said the family was worried about how isolated Dad was becoming, that nobody could reach him when Brittany was around. He said Dad's phone went straight to voicemail most of the time, and when he did answer, he could only talk for a minute before saying Brittany needed him. Nathan asked if I'd heard from Dad since our coffee meeting, and I told him what happened. Nathan was quiet, and then said he was sorry, that he'd hoped Dad would come to his senses. But it seemed like Brittany had her hooks in deep. He said the family supported whatever I needed to do to protect myself, even if that meant cutting Dad off completely. I decided to focus on building my own life instead of waiting for Dad to fix his. I picked up extra shifts at the bookstore, working mornings and weekends when it was busiest. My coworkers were college students and recent graduates like me, and we'd go out for drinks after closing sometimes. I reconnected with friends from college I'd been neglecting while dealing with the wedding situation. Sarah invited me to her New Year's party, and I went, even though I didn't feel like celebrating. It felt good to be around people who actually wanted me there, who didn't treat my presence like a problem to be managed. I started saying yes to invitations instead of staying home feeling sorry for myself. It wasn't perfect, and I still had days where I missed my dad so much it hurt to breathe, but I was building something that belonged to me instead of waiting for him to remember I existed. In late January, Aunt Coraline called while I was organizing the bookstore's fiction section. She started talking about the weather and her garden before casually mentioning that Dad's neighbor had told her husband about some loud arguments coming from Dad's house. The neighbor said Brittany's voice carried through the walls when she got upset. Coraline said the neighbor mentioned hearing something about babies and trying, though she couldn't make out full sentences. Dad apparently seemed hesitant whenever Brittany brought it up, which surprised Coraline since Dad always loved kids. I stood there holding a stack of mystery novels while processing this information. Part of me wanted to know everything about Dad's crumbling marriage, and part of me felt guilty for caring. Coraline asked if I'd heard from Dad recently, and I told her about our monthly coffee meetings, how he never mentioned Brittany or their plans. She said that was probably because things weren't going well, that Dad had always been private about relationship struggles. After we hung up, I couldn't stop thinking about why Dad would hesitate about having more kids. The next morning during my therapy appointment, I brought up Coraline's call. My therapist asked what feelings came up when I heard about Dad's marriage problems. I admitted feeling a weird mix of satisfaction and concern, like maybe Dad was finally experiencing consequences for his choices, but also worry because I still loved him despite everything. The therapist helped me understand that both reactions were normal, that I could want Dad to face the reality of his decision while still caring about his happiness. She said it wasn't wrong to hope his marriage struggled if that struggle came from natural consequences of choosing someone who demanded he exclude his family. I realized I'd been feeling guilty about not feeling worse for Dad, like I should be above wanting him to understand what he'd lost. My therapist reminded me that hoping someone learns from their mistakes wasn't the same as wishing them harm. We spent the rest of the session working through why Dad might hesitate about having kids with Brittany. I said Dad was amazing with children when I was growing up, patient and involved in ways my friends' fathers weren't. Then it hit me that maybe Dad was thinking about how Brittany had made him exclude his existing child from major moments. If she couldn't handle his daughter being at his wedding, how would she handle him splitting attention with a baby? My therapist nodded and said that was probably exactly what Dad was realizing, that Brittany's insecurity didn't just affect me, but would affect any future children too. I left therapy feeling less guilty about my complicated emotions. The bookstore was busy that afternoon with college students buying textbooks for the spring semester. I rang up purchases and recommended books while thinking about Dad sitting in his house with Brittany, probably arguing about starting a family he wasn't sure he wanted. One of my coworkers asked if I was okay because I kept zoning out between customers. I told her I was fine, just family stuff, and she said her parents were divorced too, so she got it. We talked during our break about complicated parent relationships, and it felt good to connect with someone who understood that loving a parent and being angry at them could exist at the same time. In February, I ran into Dad at the grocery store near my apartment. I was comparing prices on pasta sauce when I heard his voice in the next aisle. My stomach dropped and I considered leaving my cart and walking out, but then he turned the corner and saw me. His face did this weird thing where he looked happy for a second and then uncomfortable, like he'd forgotten he was supposed to feel awkward around me. He glanced toward the front of the store and mentioned that Brittany was waiting in the car, said it like an explanation or maybe an apology. I grabbed a jar of sauce without looking at the price and put it in my cart. Dad asked how I was doing and I said fine, keeping my answers short. He asked about my job at the bookstore and my apartment. Surface-level questions that didn't require real answers. I told him work was good and the apartment was fine, matching his energy. He mentioned the weather and I agreed it had been cold. We stood there in the pasta aisle doing this awkward dance of people who used to know each other well and now didn't know what to say. When I mentioned I'd been going to therapy, Dad's face changed. He looked guilty but didn't ask why I needed therapy, didn't ask who I was processing or what I was working through. He already knew. We both knew. He said that was good, that therapy was helpful for a lot of people, speaking in generalities instead of acknowledging that his choices were probably a main topic of my sessions. The conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes but felt like an hour. Dad kept glancing toward the front of the store like he was worried about getting caught talking to me too long. I finally said I needed to finish shopping and he nodded too quickly, relieved to have an exit. He told me to take care and I said the same, both of us using phrases people say to acquaintances. I watched him walk toward the checkout with his basket of groceries. This man who used to be my best friend now acting like I was someone he vaguely knew from work. I finished my shopping in a daze and sat in my car for 10 minutes before driving home. That night my phone buzzed with a text from Dad. He apologized for being weird at the store, said seeing me unexpectedly had thrown him off. Then he added that Brittany got upset when he talked about me, that it was easier to keep conversations short to avoid problems at home. I stared at the message for a long time. He was explaining her feelings again, asking me to understand why he couldn't act like a normal father to his daughter in a grocery store. I didn't respond. I was tired of him explaining Brittany's emotions while completely ignoring mine. I was tired of being treated like a problem instead of a person. I deleted the text and went to bed. A week later, Nadia called with more family network gossip. She'd heard from Coraline, who'd heard from the neighbor, that Brittany and Dad had been trying to get pregnant for months with no success. Nadia said Brittany had been researching fertility treatments and talking about seeing specialists. Part of me felt bad for them because struggling with fertility was genuinely hard. But mostly I felt angry that Dad might only reach out to me if he needed support through this. That I might only matter to him again if his marriage with Brittany hit a rough patch. Nadia asked how I felt about potentially having a half-sibling, and I realized I hadn't even thought that far ahead. I'd been so focused on my broken relationship with Dad that I hadn't considered what it would mean if he had another kid, if he got a chance to be the father he used to be with someone who didn't look like Mom. In early March, Dad called instead of texting. His name on my phone screen felt strange because he usually stuck to messages. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. He sounded stressed, his voice tight in a way I recognized from when he used to deal with difficult clients at work. He asked if we could have dinner, said there were things he needed to tell me about what was happening in his marriage. I wanted to say no, wanted to protect myself from whatever emotional mess he was about to dump on me. But I also wanted to know what was making him sound this desperate. I agreed to meet at a restaurant near my apartment the next evening. Dad said thank you like I was doing him a huge favor, instead of just agreeing to have dinner with my own father. The next night I got to the restaurant first and picked a table near the back. Dad arrived 10 minutes late looking like he hadn't slept well in weeks. His eyes had dark circles and his shirt was wrinkled, which wasn't like him. He used to iron everything. He sat down and ordered coffee even though it was almost 7 at night. The waitress left menus and Dad just started talking. He said Brittany's obsession with getting pregnant had taken over their entire marriage. Every month brought another disappointment when her period came. Every month meant more tension and more blame. She'd stopped wanting to do anything that wasn't related to fertility. No movies, no dinners out, no weekend trips. Everything was about tracking ovulation and taking vitamins and researching doctors. Dad looked exhausted just describing it. He said Brittany blamed the stress of the wedding situation for her fertility problems. She'd convinced herself that her body wouldn't cooperate because of all the family drama, that the negative energy from his relatives hating her had somehow affected her ability to conceive. I put down my water glass and looked at him directly. I pointed out that she had created that drama by demanding I be excluded from his wedding. She had insisted on erasing his daughter from his life, and now she was blaming the natural consequences of that choice on everyone else. Dad was quiet. He didn't immediately defend her like he usually did. He just sat there looking at his coffee cup like it might have answers. I waited for him to say more. He rubbed his face with both hands and looked older than I'd ever seen him. The restaurant felt too quiet around us, just the low hum of other people's conversations and the clink of silverware. Dad picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking, then finally spoke again. He said he'd been thinking about the wedding a lot lately, about how many people left early, about his brother's speech. He admitted he'd replayed that morning at the hotel over and over, remembered standing in my doorway unable to look at me. His voice got quieter when he said maybe choosing Brittany's comfort over having me there wasn't the right call. I felt something shift in my chest, but I didn't let it show on my face. This wasn't the full apology I needed, but it was closer than he'd ever gotten. I asked him if he was only saying this because his marriage was struggling, because Brittany couldn't get pregnant, and he was realizing what he'd given up. Dad looked genuinely hurt by that question, but he didn't get defensive. He said he deserved my suspicion after what he'd done. He admitted the fertility issues had forced him to look at his choices differently, made him see patterns he'd been ignoring. But he insisted he'd been feeling guilty since the wedding, had wanted to reach out but didn't know how after what he'd done. I told him he didn't lose his family like it was some accident that happened to him. He made a choice to push us all away when he picked Brittany's irrational demands over basic decency. I reminded him that Coraline had been nothing but kind to him, that Nathan had always supported him, that I had stood by him through the divorce and everything after. He threw all of that away because his new wife couldn't handle looking at me. Dad's shoulders slumped and he looked down at the table. He said I was right, that he'd pushed everyone away by making that choice. But even now, sitting here admitting he'd messed up, he couldn't quite say the actual words that he'd been wrong. Instead, he said he wished things had gone differently, like it was fate instead of his own decisions. I felt the familiar frustration rise up, but I kept my voice level. I pointed out there was a difference between wishing things were different and taking responsibility for making them that way. Dad nodded slowly but didn't argue. He just sat there looking sad and tired. The waitress came by to refill his coffee and ask if we wanted food. Dad ordered a sandwich he probably wouldn't eat, and I got the same. After she left, Dad asked if I'd be willing to see him occasionally, maybe have coffee once in a while away from Brittany. He said he knew he didn't deserve it, but he wanted to maintain some kind of relationship with me if I'd let him. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately because I missed my dad, missed the person he used to be before Brittany. But another part of me knew that agreeing too easily would let him off the hook, would make it seem like what he'd done was forgivable just because he felt bad now. I told him I needed to think about it, that I wanted to talk to my therapist before making any decisions about what contact with him would look like. Dad looked disappointed but said he understood. He asked if I'd at least text him after I decided, and I said I would. 2 days later, I sat in my therapist's office going over everything Dad had said at dinner. She asked good questions about what I actually wanted from a relationship with him, versus what I felt obligated to give him. We talked about boundaries and what it would mean to see him occasionally without pretending everything was fine. She helped me understand that I could maintain some connection with my father without accepting what he'd done as okay, that having limited contact didn't mean I was saying the wedding situation didn't permanently damage our relationship. By the end of the session, I had a clearer idea of what I could offer Dad without betraying myself. I could see him once a month for coffee in a public place. I wouldn't attend any events where Brittany made me unwelcome, or where I'd be expected to act like everything was normal. I wouldn't pretend the wedding never happened, or that we were back to how things used to be. If he wanted access to my life, it would be on my terms with clear boundaries. I texted Dad 3 days after our dinner. I kept it simple and said I was willing to meet once a month for coffee, but I wouldn't pretend everything was fine between us. I told him I wouldn't participate in any family events where Brittany made me unwelcome, and that I needed him to respect these boundaries without pushing for more. I hit send and felt my stomach twist with anxiety waiting for his response. It came back in less than 5 minutes. Dad said yes to everything, said he was grateful I was giving him this chance, said he'd take whatever relationship I was willing to have. The relief in his text was obvious even through the screen. Part of me felt good about setting clear terms. Another part felt sad that this was what our relationship had become, scheduled monthly meetings with rules and boundaries instead of the easy closeness we used to have. Our first coffee meeting happened in late March at a place near my apartment. I got there early and picked a table by the window where I could see Dad coming. He showed up exactly on time wearing a jacket I recognized from years ago. We ordered our drinks and sat down, and the first few minutes were awkward. Dad asked about my job at the bookstore, and I told him about the new inventory system we were learning. He talked about a project at work that was giving him trouble. We carefully avoided mentioning Brittany, the wedding, or any family members. It felt stilted and strange, but it wasn't terrible. We finished our coffee in 40 minutes, and Dad walked me to my car. He thanked me again for meeting him and asked if we could do it again next month. I said yes, and drove home feeling weird about the whole thing, like I'd just had coffee with a distant relative instead of my own father. April's coffee meeting went a little smoother. We'd found a rhythm of safe topics that wouldn't lead to fights. But near the end, Dad mentioned that Brittany had started seeing a fertility specialist who suggested counseling might help with the stress of trying to conceive. He didn't say whether they were actually going to counseling, but the fact that he was telling me felt important. It was the first time he'd voluntarily brought up Brittany in our conversations, the first crack in the wall he'd built between his marriage and his relationship with me. I asked if the specialist had found any medical reasons for the fertility issues. Dad said they were still doing tests, but so far, everything looked normal, which made Brittany more frustrated because she wanted an answer she could fix. I could hear the exhaustion in his voice when he talked about it. In early May, my phone rang with Coraline's number. She asked how I was doing, and we caught up for a few minutes before she got to the real reason for her call. She was throwing a birthday party for Nathan and wanted to invite Dad, the first time he'd been included in a family event since the wedding. Coraline said she knew it might be uncomfortable, but she was hoping enough time had passed that people could be civil. She specifically asked if I was okay with Dad being there, which I really appreciated. She wasn't assuming I'd be fine with it or putting me in a position where I'd look bad for objecting. I thought about it for a minute. I didn't want Dad's choices to keep me away from family who had supported me through everything. I told Coraline I'd come to the party and I was okay with Dad being invited too. She sounded relieved and said she'd make sure everyone knew to keep things drama-free. The party was on a Saturday afternoon at Coraline's house. I showed up with a gift for Nathan and immediately saw Dad's car in the driveway. My stomach clenched, but I went inside anyway. The house was full of family members I hadn't seen in months. Dad was standing near the kitchen talking to one of our cousins, and when he saw me, he gave a small wave. I waved back and we kept our distance, both of us being politely aware of each other without forcing interaction. Nathan made a point of talking to both of us separately, and then together, asking about our jobs and lives like he was slowly trying to rebuild bridges without pushing too hard. Other family members watched us carefully, but nobody said anything awkward. It felt like everyone was being extra careful not to upset the fragile peace. I was getting a drink from the cooler on the back porch when I heard Dad's voice through the open kitchen window. He was talking to Nathan in a low voice, but I could make out most of what he said. Dad told Nathan that marriage counseling had revealed some things about Brittany that he'd been making excuses for. He said the therapist had identified controlling behaviors, pointed out patterns of isolation and manipulation that Dad had convinced himself were just Brittany being passionate or protective. Nathan asked if Dad was planning to do anything about it. Dad's response was quiet, and I couldn't hear all of it, but he sounded tired and a bit lost, like he was finally seeing his marriage clearly, but didn't know what to do with that information. I moved away from the window before they could catch me listening, but my mind was racing with what I'd heard. I stayed at the party for another hour after overhearing Dad's conversation with Nathan, making small talk with cousins and helping clean up. Dad left before me, giving me a quick wave from across the yard that felt loaded with things neither of us knew how to say. The drive back to my apartment gave me too much time to think about what I'd heard. Marriage counseling had revealed Brittany's controlling behaviors. The therapist had identified patterns of isolation and manipulation. Dad was finally seeing his marriage clearly, but seemed stuck, like he didn't know what to do with the information. I wanted to feel satisfied that he was recognizing the problem, but mostly I felt tired. Recognizing something and actually changing it were two completely different things. 3 weeks later in early May, my phone rang while I was shelving books at work. Dad's name on the screen made my stomach tighten because he usually texted first to see if I was available. I stepped into the back room and answered. Dad sounded careful when he spoke, like he was reading from a script he'd practiced. He said Brittany wanted to apologize to me in person, that her therapist had suggested making amends for damaging his family relationships. The words felt hollow even through the phone. I asked if this was Brittany's idea or the therapist's assignment. Dad went quiet for a few seconds before admitting it had come up in their counseling session. So it was a homework task, not genuine remorse. I told Dad I'd think about it and hung up before he could push. The rest of my shift dragged while I debated whether meeting Brittany would accomplish anything real or just give her a box to check on her therapy worksheet. I called Dad back that evening and agreed to meet Brittany, but only with him present and only at a neutral location. We settled on a coffee shop halfway between our places for the following Saturday afternoon. I showed up 10 minutes early and picked a table near the window where I could see them arrive. Dad walked in first with Brittany trailing behind him, her face tight like she'd rather be anywhere else. They sat across from me and Dad immediately started talking about the weather and traffic, filling space until Brittany cleared her throat. She launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech about being overwhelmed by wedding planning and making poor choices under stress. The words came out smooth and practiced, hitting all the right notes about taking responsibility and understanding the impact of her actions. But there was no real acknowledgement of how cruel her demand had actually been, no genuine understanding that she'd made Dad choose between his wife and his daughter. She finished her apology and looked at Dad like she'd completed her task, waiting for approval. I let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking. I pointed out that she hadn't just made a poor choice under stress, but had actively excluded me from my own father's wedding, that she'd called me his painful history, and demanded I stay away from the ceremony. Brittany's face shifted from rehearsed remorse to defensive anger in seconds. She said I was being unfair, that she'd apologized and I was refusing to accept it. Dad jumped in trying to smooth things over, saying we were all doing our best and this was a good first step. I watched him fall back into his old pattern of protecting Brittany's feelings over addressing the actual problem. This apology wasn't about Brittany acknowledging what she'd done to our family. It was about her checking a box, so she could tell her therapist she'd tried. The whole meeting felt like performance rather than actual accountability. I told them both that I appreciated the attempt, but needed to see actual changed behavior before I could consider rebuilding any relationship with Brittany. Real change meant Dad being able to attend family events without her controlling his access, meant her treating me like a person instead of a ghost of his past, meant actual acknowledgement of how her demands had damaged our relationship. Dad looked disappointed but didn't immediately argue, which was at least different from his previous pattern of jumping to defend Brittany no matter what. Brittany stood up and said she'd done what her therapist asked and couldn't force me to forgive her. She left the coffee shop without looking back. Dad stayed for a few more minutes, apologizing for how the meeting had gone, but still not quite understanding why a rehearsed apology wasn't enough. I left feeling like nothing had actually changed, except now Brittany could tell her therapist she'd tried to make amends. My next therapy session focused on processing the failed apology attempt. My therapist helped me see that Dad's growing awareness of Brittany's issues didn't erase what he'd done, but it might mean he was capable of making better choices going forward. The key word was might. Awareness didn't automatically lead to change, especially when someone was still stuck in the same patterns. I was learning to hold space for both Dad's failures and his potential growth, to not dismiss the small signs of progress while also not accepting them as enough. The therapist said this was healthy boundary setting, recognizing that Dad was responsible for his choices while I was responsible for protecting myself. It felt like walking a tightrope between giving up on our relationship completely and letting him hurt me again by expecting too much too fast. In mid-June, Uncle Nathan called to catch up and mentioned he'd noticed Dad coming to more family events alone lately. Nathan said Brittany claimed social anxiety kept her from attending gatherings, but he suspected Dad was protecting his family time from her control. It was a small shift, but felt meaningful after months of Dad choosing to isolate himself. Nathan said Dad seemed more relaxed at these events, more like his old self when Brittany wasn't around to monitor his interactions. I asked if Dad talked about me at these gatherings. Nathan said my name came up occasionally, that Dad would mention something about my job or apartment, but seemed uncomfortable going deeper, like he was testing the waters of whether the family would accept him talking about me. The family was being cautiously welcoming, not pretending the wedding situation hadn't happened, but giving Dad space to slowly rebuild bridges. Dad texted me in late June asking if I wanted to get coffee, just the two of us. I agreed, and we met at a place near my apartment on a Saturday morning. He asked about my life in more depth than usual, actually listening to my answers instead of waiting for his turn to talk about his own problems. When I mentioned considering graduate school for library science, Dad's face lit up and he started asking questions about programs and specializations. He offered to help research schools like he used to when I was applying to colleges, pulling out his phone to make notes about deadlines and requirements. For 20 minutes, we talked about my future plans and it felt almost normal, like having my actual dad back instead of Brittany's husband. He didn't mention his marriage or Brittany at all, and I didn't ask. We just existed in this bubble where we were still a team figuring things out together. Dad told a story about a difficult client at work who kept changing project requirements, doing an impression of the guy's voice that made me laugh out loud. For a few minutes, it felt completely normal between us, like the past year hadn't happened and we were just catching up over coffee like we used to. Then his phone buzzed and I saw Brittany's name on the screen. Dad's whole posture changed, shoulders tensing as he read whatever message she'd sent. He typed a quick response and put the phone away, but the easy atmosphere was gone. We finished our coffee making awkward small talk and Dad promised to send me the graduate school information he'd found. Walking back to my apartment, I felt this weird mix of hope and sadness. Glimpses of my real dad still existed under everything Brittany had done to isolate him, but those glimpses felt fragile and temporary. 3 weeks later in mid-July, Dad called on a Tuesday evening. He sounded exhausted when I answered, his voice flat in a way that made me immediately worried something serious had happened. He said the fertility treatments weren't working, and Brittany was devastated by another negative test. I could hear genuine sadness for her in his voice, but also this bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond sympathy. He admitted he wasn't sure he even wanted another child at 50, that he'd been going along with the treatments because Brittany wanted them so badly, but his heart wasn't really in it. This was the most honest Dad had been with me about his marriage in months. I asked him directly if he'd told Brittany about his hesitation. Dad went quiet for a long moment before admitting he hadn't, because she was so focused on getting pregnant that he didn't want to add to her disappointment. I pointed out that this was another example of him avoiding difficult conversations to keep peace, exactly like he'd done with the wedding situation. He was so afraid of conflict with Brittany that he couldn't be honest about something as major as whether he wanted more children. Dad went quiet after I said that, staring at his coffee cup like it might have answers written on the bottom. He set it down carefully and rubbed his face with both hands, looking older than I'd seen him in years. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and tired. He said I was right, that he'd been so scared of fighting with Brittany that he'd just made everything worse instead of better. He admitted he kept choosing her comfort over being honest because conflict felt impossible, like one wrong word would blow up his whole marriage. This was the closest he'd ever come to actually seeing his pattern, to understanding that avoiding hard conversations had cost him almost everyone who mattered. I didn't say anything, just let him sit with that truth while the coffee shop buzzed around us with normal people having normal conversations about normal problems. 3 weeks passed before Dad texted again, asking if we could meet for coffee in early August. I said yes, and showed up at the same place on a Saturday morning. Dad looked rough when he walked in, like he hadn't been sleeping well. He ordered his usual black coffee and sat across from me, fidgeting with the cup sleeve. After the standard questions about my job and apartment, he mentioned his birthday had been the week before. I'd sent a text but hadn't called because I wasn't sure if Brittany would answer his phone. Dad said he'd spent it with just Brittany at home because she didn't want a family party. His voice went flat when he said it, like he was reporting facts instead of talking about something that clearly hurt. I asked if the family had done anything, and he nodded slowly. Aunt Coraline had organized a big gathering at her house with everyone there, all his siblings and their kids and even some cousins who drove in from out of state. Dad hadn't been invited because Brittany said family events gave her anxiety, and he couldn't come without her. He stared at his coffee and admitted he was tired of being cut off from everyone, tired of missing birthdays and holidays and regular Sunday dinners. The sadness in his voice was different from before, less defensive and more just exhausted with how small his world had gotten. I told Dad something I'd been thinking about for months. I said he was allowed to want both things, a marriage and a family, that one shouldn't have to cancel out the other. Healthy relationships don't make you choose between your partner and everyone else who matters. Don't require cutting off your whole support system to keep peace. Dad listened without interrupting, which was new. I said Brittany asking him to isolate himself wasn't love. It was control, and he deserved better than walking on eggshells in his own life. When I finished, Dad nodded like he understood what I meant. But then he didn't say anything about changing things or standing up to Brittany or making different choices. He just sat there looking sad and stuck, trapped in this pattern he could finally see but didn't know how to break. We finished our coffee talking about safer topics, and when we left I felt this weird mix of hope that he was waking up and frustration that waking up wasn't the same as doing anything about it. September came and I was settling into a routine at work, picking up extra weekend shifts to save money for graduate school applications. On a Tuesday afternoon, someone knocked on my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and looked through the peephole to see Dad standing there looking shaken and pale. I opened the door, and he just stood in the hallway for a second before asking if he could come in. He walked to my couch and sat down heavily, elbows on his knees and head in his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red like he'd been crying or trying not to cry. He said he and Brittany had a huge fight the night before, the biggest one they'd ever had. He'd finally told her the truth, that he wasn't sure about having kids, that at 50, he didn't know if he wanted to start over with a baby. Brittany had completely lost it, screaming at him about wasting her time and her fertile years. The fight went on for hours with her saying he'd lied to her about wanting a family, that she never would have married him if she'd known he was going to back out of their deal. Dad leaned back against my couch and closed his eyes. He told me Brittany had threatened to leave him if he didn't commit right now to doing whatever it takes to have a baby. She wanted him to agree to more fertility treatments, more doctor appointments, more money spent on procedures that might not even work. She said if he couldn't give her this one thing she wanted, then their whole marriage was pointless, and she'd wasted a year of her life. The way Dad described it, Brittany hadn't asked what he wanted or tried to understand his feelings. She'd just made it clear that her vision of their life together was the only one that mattered, and he either got on board or got out. Dad opened his eyes and looked at me with this broken expression. He said he was starting to realize that Brittany's idea of compromise was him doing whatever she wanted, that his actual feelings about anything didn't seem to count for much in their marriage. I sat down next to Dad and asked him a question nobody had asked in a long time. I said, "Forget what Brittany wants, and forget what you think you should want. What do you actually want for yourself?" Dad's face crumpled and he started crying, really crying in a way I hadn't seen since Mom left. He said he wanted his daughter back, wanted his family back, wanted to stop feeling like he was walking on broken glass every day in his own marriage. He said he missed Sunday dinners at Aunt Coraline's house and his brother's bad jokes and just being around people who actually liked him instead of tolerated him. He missed having a life that was bigger than just him and Brittany in their house with all her rules about who he could see and when. Dad wiped his eyes and said he didn't even recognize himself anymore, that he'd become this small, anxious version of who he used to be, and he hated it. Watching him break down like that hurt, but also felt necessary, like something that needed to happen before anything could get better. When Dad calmed down, I handed him a glass of water and sat back down. He drank it slowly, and then set the glass on my coffee table with shaking hands. He looked at me directly, and said something he'd never said before. He apologized for banning me from his wedding, clearly and without excuses. He said choosing Brittany's crazy demand over me was the biggest mistake of his life. Dad's voice cracked when he said he'd been so desperate to make his second marriage work, so scared of failing again, that he'd sacrificed the relationship that actually mattered most. He said he was deeply sorry for treating me like I didn't matter, for picking someone he barely knew over the daughter who'd been there through everything. It was the first real apology I'd gotten from him since that awful morning at the hotel, and hearing it felt like something heavy lifting off my chest, even though I knew one apology couldn't fix everything that had broken between us. I told Dad I forgave him, but I needed him to understand something. Rebuilding trust was going to take time, a lot of time. One apology didn't erase a whole year of being treated like I was invisible, like my feelings didn't count, like our relationship could just be turned off and on based on Brittany's mood. I said I was willing to work on things between us, but it had to be real work, not just him saying sorry and then going back to the same patterns. Dad nodded and didn't get defensive or make excuses. He just accepted what I said with this genuine sadness and remorse that felt different from before. He told me he understood, and he was willing to do whatever it took to earn back my trust, even if it took years. We sat there in my tiny apartment for another hour just talking, really talking for the first time since before Brittany came into our lives. It wasn't perfect and it didn't fix everything, but it felt like maybe we could find our way back to something real. Over the next few weeks, something shifted. Dad started showing up to family events regularly again, sometimes with Brittany when she was willing, but more often alone. The first time he came to Sunday dinner at Aunt Coraline's house without her, the whole room went quiet for a second. But then Aunt Coraline just hugged him, and Uncle Nathan clapped him on the shoulder and everyone went back to their conversations. The family welcomed him back but carefully, not pretending the wedding situation hadn't happened, but giving him space to slowly rebuild the bridges he'd burned. After dinner, Uncle Nathan pulled me aside in the kitchen while we were doing dishes. He said Dad seemed more like himself than he had in over a year, more relaxed and present instead of that tense, anxious version we'd all been watching. Uncle Nathan said the family was cautiously hopeful that Dad was finding his way back to them, back to being the person they remembered before Brittany. Dad called me a few days after that dinner and said he and Brittany had started intensive marriage counseling. He sounded exhausted, but also relieved, like finally dealing with their problems directly was better than pretending everything was fine. He told me the counselor had identified some serious issues in how they communicate and how Brittany handles conflict, stuff that went deeper than just the fertility struggles. Dad admitted he didn't know if their marriage would survive working through all this, that some of what was coming up in therapy was making him question whether they were actually compatible long-term. I told him I'd support whatever decision he made about his marriage as long as he kept one promise. He had to promise he wouldn't abandon his family again, wouldn't cut us all off if things got hard with Brittany. Dad promised immediately, his voice firm in a way it hadn't been in months. He said losing me and losing his family had taught him what actually mattered, and he wasn't going to make that mistake twice. By late October, we'd found our new rhythm. Dad and I met for coffee twice a month at this place near my apartment, nothing fancy but familiar enough that we both felt comfortable there. He started coming to Sunday dinners at Aunt Coraline's house again, sometimes with Brittany, but usually alone. The family welcomed him back without making a big deal about it, just passed him dishes and asked about work like he'd never been gone. Our relationship wasn't what it was before the wedding. I couldn't just forget the year where he chose Brittany's feelings over having me in his life, couldn't pretend that abandoning me at the hotel hadn't fundamentally changed how I saw him. But we were rebuilding something, and this version felt more honest somehow. He didn't expect me to just accept being treated poorly anymore. When he talked about Brittany now, he was more realistic about her issues instead of making excuses. I noticed he stopped trying to convince me she was misunderstood, or that her behavior was justified by stress. He just acknowledged that some of her actions had been wrong, that he should have stood up for me sooner. It wasn't the relationship we had when I was growing up, but it was something we were building together on ground that felt more solid. Brittany eventually stopped fighting Dad about the family stuff. She realized he wasn't going to cut everyone off again no matter how much she complained about it. They reached this compromise where she didn't have to come to every family event, but she couldn't stop him from going. It wasn't ideal, and you could tell Dad was still walking on eggshells sometimes, but it was functional. He seemed relieved to have his life back, to be able to see his siblings and cousins without it turning into a huge fight with Brittany. At one Sunday dinner, Uncle Nathan pulled me aside and said Dad looked more relaxed than he had in over a year. I agreed but didn't say what I was thinking, which was that Dad still had this tension in his shoulders whenever his phone buzzed, like he was bracing for Brittany to be upset about something. In November, Dad showed up at my apartment with a stack of papers about graduate programs. He'd spent hours researching schools that had good programs for what I wanted to study, printing out information about funding options and application requirements. It reminded me of how he used to help with college applications, back when we were a team, and he knew everything about my plans. We spent a whole Saturday at my tiny kitchen table working through applications together. He read my essays and made suggestions that actually improved them, asked questions that helped me figure out what I really wanted to say. For those few hours, it felt like having my real dad back, the one who used to help with homework he didn't understand and showed up to every soccer game. But I also knew things had permanently changed between us. There was this awareness now that our relationship could be broken, that he was capable of choosing someone else over me when things got hard. I loved him and was glad we were rebuilding, but I'd never fully trust him the same way again. He seemed to understand that without me having to say it. A year after the wedding that broke everything between us, Dad and I were building something new. It wasn't the easy closeness we had before. Wasn't that automatic trust where I never questioned whether he'd be there for me? This version was more complicated, built on both of us being more honest about our limits and needs. I'd learned I didn't need his approval to know my worth, that I could survive him letting me down and still be okay. He was learning that real love means choosing people even when it's uncomfortable, even when your partner wants you to make it easier by cutting them off. We weren't perfect, and probably never would be again. But we were finally moving forward together instead of him moving away, while I stood still waiting for him to remember I mattered.